All right, welcome back to our show again. I have a question that gets asked to me by people who want to work on diesels and don't know a whole lot about them, and even other technicians that, well, they work on diesels a little bit, maybe they're mainly working on gas engines, and I understand that because working on diesels is a little bit different. You have to deal about how fast it cranks to maybe start and how much compression you have and how much fuel you've got. And there's no spark plugs. And sometimes things, no matter, it should run. You'd think, well, this thing should run. I mean, it turns over. I got fuel. Why won't it run? And they always ask me, say, where do you begin on a diesel? And I said, well, I guess where do you begin? The same way you would on a gasoline engine car. You grab a computer, a scanner, and if your car comes in with a no crank, no start, first thing you do is you verify it'll turn over, or what it will do. Turn the key. Does it turn over? Yes or no? Okay, yeah, it turns over. Does it turn over fast enough? Yes or no? And when you say fast enough, diesels need to turn over about 400 RPMs. I mean, that's 400 revolutions per minute in order to crank. That gives it enough speed for it to light things off and work like it's supposed to. That's something you need to see. So if you got a diesel that's got weak batteries in it, charge your batteries up first, and that might help it get started. Not saying that's your problem, but you got to have batteries that are able, and a starter that'll turn around 400 RPMs. I don't care what kind of diesel it is, they have to turn around 400 RPMs. Whether it's Duramax, Power Stroke, Cummins, they're all about the same, about 400 RPMs. The second thing is that I tell everyone that you got to have fuel pressure. Now, on today's cars, they take low pressure, 45, 50 pounds, somewhere in the general area, and they bump it up to 3,000 to 4,000 pounds of pressure. That's right. That's how that works. So it's a high pressure. So the most important thing is you can't really see a lot of high pressure readings unless you got scanners that can do that. But the low pressure reading you can do with the same tools you'd use on a gasoline engine. It's the same exact tool as a fuel pressure gauge. And you see what kind of fuel pressure you have on the low side. You've got to have fuel pressure. So you look the RPMs, you have around 400 RPMs, yes or no. And if you have RPMs, that tells me the cam sensor is working. And that's very, very important. If you don't have a cam sensor, the injectors have no idea when to fire. They have the foggiest idea because they don't know where number one is. They got to figure out where top dead center is and number one cylinder. Once they figure out where that is, it's no problem for the injectors to fire. They've got to have that information. So if you've got all that information and the car still won't start, it turns over, it's got fuel pressure, and it turned over, it's got fuel pressure, and it's got RPMs. And you say, well, it won't run. About the only thing left that I can think of, like on a Ford product, would be the injector driver module, or another name, that's on the older model 7.3s. And then on the 6-liter engines, you have what's called the FICA and the fuel injection control module. They do about the same thing. They allow 12 volts to be bumped up to 90 to 110 volts to fire the injectors, because these injectors are being fired by not only electrically, they're being fired also by high pressure oil. In order for this engine to crank, it's got to have around 700 pounds of oil pressure. I know that sounds unbelievable. I know you say 700 pounds, how can it be that high? Trust me, it's got a regular oil pump that runs at around 35 to 45 PSI, when it's cranking. And then it goes to a high pressure pump that turns it into really high pressure, and that's what fires the injectors. And you have to look at that. If you don't see 700 or more PSI per square inch when this engine's cranking over on a scanner, it ain't going to bust off. You've got to see that. Honest to goodness, you've got to see that. So that's the things that we look for. Do we have good oil pressure? Do we have good RPMs? Do we have good fuel pressure? And if it still won't crank, I'm serious. I keep one of these in my box all the time. It's called an IDM, injector driver module. And that's for the 7.3s, and that's from 96 to 2003. I keep that part. It's a good one that came out of a total truck. Bought it years ago, and people want to buy it all the time. I go, no, it's not for sale. This is for test purposes. I mean, to replace this part, it's a $700 part. And I keep this just for fire. When they won't fire up, I plug that in. If it tries to start up and run, there it is. We had one yesterday, same exact problem. My guys were like watching me go, where do you begin on this? I said, get the codes out of it. What kind of codes do you have? Well, it had a cam code in it, and a couple of minor codes in it. I said, well, cam sensor could be faulty, but I said, if you got RPMs, it's not the cam sensor. So we wrote the codes down that we had in there, turned the key. Oh yeah, we saw the other one showing intake air temperature out of range. And sure enough, it was showing 40 below zero. I went, 40 below zero. I said, that can make the computer want to dump more fuel down to fire it up because it thinks it's 40 below zero. And they just unplugged the sensor. Plug the sensor back in, it just cranking. Still didn't want to bust off. I said, the only thing I can think of, it's got fuel pressure, it's got an RPM sensor, it's got, I know the timing sounds correct. It doesn't sound like it's slip timing. They don't normally do that very often. Put an injector driver module in there. As soon as I turned the key, it tried to fire up. I went, oh, there we go. After about 3 or 4 tries, it fired right up, ran rough because they had all this fuel dumped down inside it from being 40 below zero. And after a few minutes, it smoothed out and ran okay. Called the customer up and said, okay, here's what you're going to need. You're going to need this injector driver module. Well, today's cars don't have injector driver modules, but on these Ford Power Strokes, they have what's called a fuel injection control module. Does the same thing. And that's a very common failure problem with those as well. And they can be rebuilt or replaced. You can do what's called a half shell where you only change half of it. And the point being is, if you're working on diesels, you need to get training. You need to be able to have a scanner that's bidirectional. When I work on a Ford, I have to have a Ford scanner. I have to have one that comes from Ford itself, because if you are working on a Ford and you don't have that scanner, even though sometimes you get the parts installed correctly, if you don't have that part married to this car, and things ain't going to happen. Things are not going to work. Things are not going to run. That, like computers, they have to be married to the car. We had one come in, a 97 model. Customer's complaint was, doesn't shift right. Hard shifting. Yeah, we checked the fluid out. Fluid looks good. Filter looks good. Pressure looks good. No codes in it whatsoever. I drive it. Said, yeah, it's kind of harsh shifting from second to third. I said, more than likely it might be a reflash. That can't be it. Okay, suit yourself. I said, Then about a year later, he comes back and said, this thing's still shifting hard. I said, what have you done to it since I last talked to you? Well, I changed the fluid again. I did this and changed the filter, and I did that, and I put this on there, and I put another throttle positioning sensor on it. I said, any changes? He said, no. I said, are you going to let me reprogram it now? And he goes, okay, reprogram it. I reprogrammed it. As soon as we went for a test drive, he said, I cannot believe the difference in how it shifts. I said, I was trying to get you to do this for the last year and you wouldn't do it. You can put all the new parts you want on these cars, but until you have the computer program for the adaptives that this car has developed over the years, because the clutch packs aren't as tight as they used to be. The parameters on shift have changed over the years. The car is older now. It's a 20-year-old truck. They realize that these things happen, and this is what they have to do to take care of it. If you bought a computer 20 years ago, you wouldn't ever think about continue to use that computer without updating it. Well, why do you think you can get by with driving a car or a truck without updating the computer in it? You are driving, people within the sound of my voice, you're driving a computer on 4 wheels. If it's I can tell you this, if it's a 96 and newer, in most cases, not all cases, in most cases, the computer can be programmed to see if there's little gremlins hanging around there like shift quality or idle quality or air conditioning problems. All these problems might be solved by reprogramming. Not saying it will, but it might be. And I have had people that have worked trying to fix problems. One was my air conditioning belt keeps popping off on my Chevrolet. I said, excuse me? He says, I have broke my air conditioning belt 3 times on my delivery truck. And I said, really? He said, yeah, 3 times over the last 2 years. And I said, there's probably a reprogramming for it to stop that from happening. He says, are you going to try to tell me there's a reprogramming to stop an air conditioning belt from breaking? Oh, yep, there sure is. And he said, I'd like to see that. And I went and plugged this car into it and pulled it up. And it says, reprogramming on trucks to stop engagement of AC compressor on wide open throttle. What was happening was this car, even at wide open throttle, when he was passing or whatever, the compressor would stay on. Sometimes it would engage when it was under wide open throttle, throwing the belt off. So they had a program in there so when you push it to wide open throttle, the compressor wouldn't kick on. The compressor would stay off, allowing it to be able to pass without throwing the belt. We reprogrammed the truck, and he never broke another belt. And he said, I just find that so hard to believe. And I said, sir, it's not me that makes these things up. It's just the way they're designed. They realized after a while they kept throwing these belts off, and what was throwing the belts off was the compressor was kicking on or staying on while you were under wide open throttle. Years ago, when we had carburetors on cars, when you went wide open throttle, it automatically kicked off the compressor because they needed all the power they could get. I'm serious, like a little Chevette. If you pushed a wide open throttle, man, you didn't have an AC compressor. It kicked it right off because it wanted to have all the power you can get, and that compressor robbed it of power. Well, on trucks, when they had these bigger engines of 4.8s, 5.3s, the 6-liter, that wasn't a problem. They said, we can't tell any difference in power, but unfortunately, when it kicked off when you're at 5,000 RPMs, and all of a sudden that compressor kicks on when you're at wide open throttle, it just wasn't designed for that. And a lot of times that belt would pop off or break. And that's how we solve that problem by doing reprogramming. Same thing with EGR codes. If you're getting a car that comes in with false EGR codes, and the shop has changed the EGR valve, they've done this, they've done that, they changed the DPFE sensor, the hoses, the EGR valve, they've made sure the passageways are cleaned out on this Ford, and it keeps setting a P0401, insufficient flow. I have seen this I don't know how many times. Insufficient flow, insufficient flow, insufficient flow. Car has about 80 to 100,000 miles on the EGR. I mean, it's working like it's supposed to. It passes the test, it does everything. What it is just a reprogramming. There's a glitch in there that says, hey, I'm not getting enough flow when I'm supposed to be getting flow, and it throws a light on, throws a code. Nothing wrong with anything. It's just the parameters need to be reset so they're a little bit more forgiving. That's all it takes. Reprogram it, problem solved. Customer doesn't spend hours and hundreds of dollars trying to diagnose a check engine light that really isn't a problem. But when that light comes on, that's where it gets tempting to somebody to put a piece of tape over it, black tape, because they don't want to see that light come on. I've had people say, that's the best advice you can give us, is put black tape over it. I said, really, it's not good advice to do that, because if you have a check engine light and it's for something as simple as an EGR valve, that's right. Something as simple as the EGR valve, which is way up in that's part of the component systems test and the EGR test. If it doesn't run that test, it's not going to look at your catalytic converters. It won't run that test, and it won't run an EVAP test. The last two tests that get run on a vehicle, on the system readiness monitors, you got component monitors, spark plug, misfire. Those are the very first ones that get run. This, all components, and then it starts looking at oxygen sensor heaters, and it starts looking at the oxygen sensors, and it starts looking at the EGR valve, and it looks at that right there, and the EVAPs, and then EGR valve, and then after it does the EGR valve, make sure it's working, and the catalytic converters are working like they're and they seem the oxygen sensors are working like it's supposed to. Only then it looks at the catalytic converter and says, okay, everything's working like it's supposed to. Let's see how this catalytic converter works if we add a little fuel to it or a little air to it, and it tests the catalytic converter. But if it never tests it, it can actually go bad, and you can actually ruin your catalytic converters because you ignored a check engine light over an EGR valve that costs just a few dollars, cost you thousands, hundreds, maybe even thousands of dollars to fix on your high-end car. Hey, this is James Morris. It's been a great Tuesday show as far as getting some information out there. If you have any questions, give us a call at 850-763-0555 or email me at james@masterautotech.com, and we'll be back tomorrow morning. Bye-bye, everybody.